Going on here in Washington you may be unaware of, something that sort of snuck under the noses of a whole lot of people. And if it continues on this path, that something could make it much more difficult for the bad guys to get punished and the good guys to get praised. In fact, it will have the opposite effect. So here's what's going on. Yesterday, the House Subcommittee on Capital Markets and Government-Sponsored Enterprises passed through a bill that severely weakens protections for whistleblowers and could now be considered any time by the full House Financial Services Committee. Now, this has the backing and the lobbying dollars of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which has often been pretty friendly to Wall Street interests and pretty powerful as well. And here's what it would do if it passed. It would require a whistleblower to first report information about misconduct to his or her employer. And it's funny with a lot of things here in Washington. The title of this bill is a little deceptive. It's called the Whistleblower Improvement Act. So there's this. And speaking of whistleblowers, the accused WikiLeaks whistleblower Bradley Manning begins his trial next week. Also, as it turns out, President Obama has used the Espionage Act to charge 6 people for alleged mishandling of classified information. Before Obama, there were only 3 cases ever charged under the Espionage Act. So I want to talk about the changing face of whistleblowing in this country, and I've got someone who knows a whole lot about it. Peter Van Buren. Peter is the author of We Meant Well, You write that there is now an unprecedented assault on government whistleblowers and leakers of every sort. And I know that you charge that, the number of cases and what's going on here, it suggests that there's actually an organized strategy against whistleblowers in America. Talk about what you mean by this.
Without a doubt. The Obama administration, as you pointed out, has doubled the number of prosecutions against its own employees using the Espionage Act for whistleblowing. In addition, the government has also gone out of its way to use a number of extra legal tools against whistleblowers whose cases don't rise to the level of the Espionage Act, or in cases where there's not enough evidence or the government doesn't want to make a big deal out of it. This is something it's created a war in Washington. It's going on just below our noses, but it is indeed a struggle.
And it is going on, and it's definitely important to talk about this. Of course, right now, one of the most well-known, famous whistleblowers of our time is, of course, Bradley Manning. He is the accused WikiLeaks whistleblower. Let's talk about him, but compare his situation, in which he spent, I believe, at least 9 months in solitary confinement before he was even charged. That situation to Daniel Ellsberg. Daniel Ellsberg, of course, did a lot of research and wrote a report that became the Pentagon Papers. That was released, in several newspapers back in the 70s, and in a lot of ways, for a while at least, maybe not by the government, but by the general public, Daniel Ellsberg was thought of as an inspiration, as a hero. What has changed?
What's changed is the attitude of the United States. The government has become more...
Though. I mean, we're going through a period right now where, the government either seems unwilling or unable to respond to some of the wrongdoing on Wall Street. So when we think about these huge Wall Street corporations, we think about people at the top who made decisions that, consciously or not, ended up dragging this economy in the mud and hurt a whole lot of people. We have, of course, seen a couple settlements here and there, but no one still today, in 2012, almost 4 years after the financial collapse, has really been held accountable. So when we think about that, and we think about people who could actually bring evidence to the forefront, those are people that in most cases would have been inside these big companies. Why would it be that anyone would want to make it so these people couldn't come forward?
Well, the Whistleblower Improvement Act is kind of a creative name. It shows that there is still a sense of humor up on Capitol Hill. Because what it would actually...
The SEC or another government regulator, that government regulator would have to then tell their company before any sort of action could be taking place. I mean, it seems to me that, this sort of checks and balances system, that there's an attitude in Washington, and of course this bill has not been passed, but it's moving along. But there seems to be an attitude that checks and balances aren't needed anymore.
What we're finding is increasingly in the United States, particularly in the government, an organization that doesn't want checks and balances, that wants to avoid...
And bringing to light wrongdoings that are harming people, whether it's people in Iraq, as you've done, or people in the U.S. You mentioned Colonel Morris Davis, and I want to talk a little bit more about him because we actually had the chance to interview him here on RT. He is, of course, the former lead prosecutor of military tribunals at Guantanamo Bay. And I want to just play a little bit about what he said and then talk about it.
My policy, my resignation.
So here at Guantanamo, Colonel Davis submitted his resignation, but as you mentioned, his later job as a researcher at the Library of Congress was taken from him after an op-ed and editorial in the Wall Street Journal expressing similar sentiments. I mean, do you think that this says that in this day and age, it's just not going to fly anymore?
It's a very chilling action. And
you felt the effects of this firsthand. What do you think this does to the U.S. as a country, to us as a society, when these rules are made more stringent rather than expanding?
On my part, I'm embarrassed for my employer, the Department of State.
Comfortable enough to come forward. Imagine how many wrongdoings will not get reported and will continue to go on, benefiting only a few people and continuing to harm quite a few more. Peter Van Buren, author, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.